Hello out there. Welcome to Wake Up to the Bible. I'm Daniel Kaplan. I'm here with my father, Dr. Kaplan. We're going through the books of the law, Genesis through Deuteronomy, over the course of this year. So we're breaking it up into little portions. It's the traditional Jewish portions of the week. So you just get a little bit every day. Today we're going to be reading Genesis 14, 1 through 20. And I'm going to have my dad read because there's a lot of names in here, and he does better with that sort of stuff. Go ahead, sir.
So I'm in Genesis 14, and it came to pass in the days of Amraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Ellasar, Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of nations, that they made war with Bera, king of Sodom, with Birsha, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Admah, Shemeber, king of Zeboiim, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar. All these joined together in the Valley of Siddim, that is the Salt Sea. 12 years they served Chedorlaomer, and in the 13th year they rebelled. In the 14th year, Chedorlaomer and the kings that were with him came and attacked the Rephaim in Ashteroth Karnaim, the Zuzim in Ham, and the Emim in Shaveh Kiriathaim, and the Horites in their mountain of Seir, as far as El Paran, which is by the wilderness. Then they turned back and came to En Mishpat, that is Kadesh, and attacked all the country of the Amalekites, and also the Amorites who dwelt in Hazezon Tamar. And the king of Sodom, the king of Gomorrah, the king of Admah, the king of Zeboiim, the king of Bela, that is Zoar, went out and joined, and the king of Bela, that is Zoar, went out and joined together in battle in the Valley of Siddim against Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, Tidal, king of nations, Amraphel, king of Shinar, and Arioch, king of Ellasar, 4 kings against 5. Now the Valley of Siddim was full of asphalt pits, and the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled. Some fell there, and the remainder fled to the mountains. And they took all the goods of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their provisions and went their way. They also took Lot, Abram's brother's son, who dwelt in Sodom, and his goods, and departed. Then one who had escaped came and told Abram the Hebrew, for he dwelt in the terebinth trees of Mamre, the Amorite, brother of Eshcol and brother of Aner, and they were allies with Abram. Now when Abram heard that his brother was taken captive, he armed his 318 trained servants who were born in his own house and went in pursuit as far as Dan. He divided the forces against them by night, and he and his servants attacked them and pursued them as far as Hobah, which is north of Damascus. So he brought back all the goods, and also brought back his brother Lot and his goods, as well as the women and the people. And the king of Sodom went out to meet him at the valley of Shaveh, that is the king's valley, after his return from the defeat of Chedorlaomer and the kings who were with him. Then Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was the priest of God Most High. And he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram of God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand.
Keep going.
Oh, and he gave him a tithe of all. Yeah. Yes, and he gave him a tithe of all. That concludes the scripture.
All right. So one thing that has been pointed out is the way that this chapter gets started is different sort of language, and it came to pass. I think this is the first. This is the first time that this is used in. Anyway, it's certainly different than the passages up to it. So it gives us that transition, right? And obviously, we are going to have a transition in terms of the way the story is being told, because we go from this very limited view of Abram to now we're going to go out to the world, see kind of what's going on, and then we come back to Abram again in the middle of all of this, right? Um, this is an interesting story. I would say one thing you can get out of it, and this is my idea, is that you have Abram, who is a peacemaker in the last chapter, right, with his brother, but in this one, when push comes to shove and he has to self defense, he has to maintain himself. He is ready, and he is not only ready to go to war, but he has strategy, and like you were saying, he's prepared for this scenario. What are some of the things that come to mind when you read this section?
It's rather interesting how the section is so detailed, constantly listing the names of the kings, 4 kings versus 5, but constantly listing their names. Um, One thing that comes to mind is just, I suppose, to emphasize the historicity of the account, that you should look at it as a historical account. Um, uh, I also want to mention that those who put the Bible together had a certain authority to make edits. And for example, in verse 14, when it says that Abraham pursued them as far as Dan, probably that's what we might call an anachronistic reference, but it's so that you'll know when you're reading it where he went. And so evidently there was a period in history when scribes had the authority to make these edits to make the account understandable. That's what I would say. I also want to mention something interesting from a gematria point of view. Abraham had a servant. Evidently, his main servant was Eliezer, who was steward over his house. And the numerical value of Eliezer is 318. And I think it mentions here that Abraham took 318 men with him in verse 14, which was the numerical value of Eliezer. Just kind of an interesting point. I think Josephus works with this somehow. I may be wrong. I have to go back and review, but I think in Josephus' account, it's just Abram and Eliezer that go out there, and he may be going by the gematria concept. It would seem to me more reasonable that he had a group with him, he had allies with him when you keep reading, and that even though his force may have been smaller, but he did have a force, and he evidently utilized it very effectively. So even though he was outnumbered, in other words, you could look at this as God honoring Abram, and even though he might have lost looking at the odds, but the underdog was the winner. It's similar to the Maccabees as they fought Antiochus. They were the underdog and they were the winner.
Getting back to what you were saying about the historicity, this is what Robert Alter has to say. He says there's a good argument for its relative antiquity because 4 of the 5 invading kings have authentic Akkadian, Elamite, or Hittite names, and that he says, like you said, the modern place names is probably somebody putting it back in there so that the audience would understand. But to him, that doesn't meddle with the timing. Obviously, there's some scholars that would love to use that and date it a lot differently, but at least in his mind, that doesn't work for that. And to your point, the fact that all those names are in there in his mind gives it more validity, from a scholarship perspective to look at it straightforward. So let's get to Melchizedek, right? Melchizedek is a very mysterious figure because we don't really get too much more about him than this, a little bit, but he's a little mysterious. Different theories on him. He's from Salem, which is a beautiful city in Oregon, right? But yeah, but of course, you have bread and wine, so you think of that. You have tithing, so you think of that. So go ahead, Melchizedek.
There's also Salem, Massachusetts. Melchizedek is very thoroughly discussed in the book of Hebrews, and much is made of the meaning of his name. Melchizedek, King of righteousness, King of Salem, King of peace. It's also probably Jerusalem. And the bread and wine that he brings out. Let me say this about war in the Middle East. The ideal time for war is in the spring. The heavy rains are gone, but it's not too hot and too dry, and it's not too cold. The time for war in the Middle East is spring, and so very likely this is in the spring, and you have Melchizedek bringing out bread and wine. So what comes to mind, obviously, is the Passover, and for Christians the communion. You can't help but think about that, and Melchizedek, we see from the book of Hebrews, is a type of Christ by his name and by his actions here. And he blesses Abraham. It's interesting, as pointed out in the book of Hebrews, he's the one that blesses Abraham. And also, Abraham gives him a tithe. which the fact that I had to read it later maybe emphasizes that. So I would say that if you want to take the book of Hebrews out of context without looking at the Bible as a whole, you can get overly mystical about it. And no doubt there are legends and traditions, but I believe the book of Hebrews is telling us that this was a person, this was a human being who, was in Canaan at the time. Whether he was Canaanitish or a descendant of Shem, we could argue that. The Jews, many Jews identify him with Shem, but I think chronologically that wouldn't be the case. But maybe he was a descendant of Shem. But he had a ministry in the land of Canaan, and he is a Gentile priest, but he was priest of God Most High. So he recognized the supreme being at the time, even though he was in a polytheistic environment. But his God was God Most High. So he is used here as a type of Jesus Christ because there's no genealogy given for him. He just appears, nor does it talk about his death later. He's just there. So that's why the book of Hebrews says what it says about him. There's no beginning, there's no end. He just appears, and Abraham gives him a tithe. So I believe here we're dealing with a human being who is used as a type of Jesus Christ.
All right. Well, if you have one of those interesting theories, feel free to comment below and maybe we'll talk about it sometime. If you are enjoying this show, and I'm sure you are, please like, subscribe, ring the bell. Oh, I should ask you, did you have anything else?
Well, we do see the example here of tithing, and we'll see it again in the case of Jacob. So it is certainly something to respect and consider as we consider how to live as Christians. We have this example of the patriarchs, both Abraham and Jacob, the tithe being mentioned here.
All right. Well, on that note, please like, subscribe, hit the bell, and we will see you tomorrow.